Let's begin with Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's famous essay and question, Can the Subaltern Speak? But in relation to animation, because while Spivak's question deals with the shadows of epistemic colonialism, I want to consider, if only for this brief video, performance theory, in particular Irving Goffman's performance paradigm, as its own hegemony. Performance is an incredibly seductive mode in looking at Net-juu no Susume, and it makes a lot of sense. After all, there are people pretending to be other people online, or even in the case of Moriko, you can argue that it's her failing to perform as a long-standing corporate office lady for the rest of her life. But performance theory often works on very specific axioms in that you have a self managing your performance as a sort of attachment, and this management is determined by fixities that is modified by audiences. Roughly speaking, I am now this fixed genuine, and this other moment is a performance. And I'd argue that Net-juu isn't consistently about performance. So here's where performance becomes hegemonic. A frequent motif of performance, itself often a benefactor of psychoanalysis, is the mirror. The mirror acts as a way in which a subject can be controlled. The multiplicity of identity is given definition in the mirror. And it makes sense in Net-juu. For instance, in Moriko, when she looks into the mirror, she is compressed into a figure that has to clean up to be presentable. We know she's more than that, but the mirror functions as a way to control her as a subject. So it does establish the mirror as a central motif, and yet the mirror isn't consistent. Reflection in Net-juu isn't consistent. After all, the ending of Net-juu has Moriko and Sakurai walk away holding hands. But what's left? Well, it's their avatars, Hayashi and Lily. Now, there are two ways to look at this that make quite a bit of sense. First, we can take a look at it as a sort of growing up lens in which Moriko thereby casts away her old neat identity, but that message does seem to instrumentalize these relationships in somewhat dangerous political ideals, that if a subject is not a faithful working subject of Japan Inc., then all instances of them deviating from the norm are meant to be this infantile endeavor, and there's quite a bit of sympathy for that position to be the only position. But I think there's also another way to look at this, and that is by considering alternatives to the performance lens. If we believe that Moriko is not actually performing, but rather inhabiting or injecting another self onto the virtual space, then this is no different than friends with their own sort of sapience looking back with fondness at what happens. This makes quite a bit of sense when you consider that the reflection, the mirror, plays the disjuncture of performance right in the opening. The mirror is a constant image, but when her character holds it up, who is looking back? It's not Moriko, it's the others. And in the moment when she walks from right to left, her initial reflection in the water is her character, but then it changes. It changes to Lily. In this moment, the mirror doesn't reflect the singular subject performing to be, but rather it acts like a window, a way in which we enter into another world, and this makes a lot of sense. Paul Manning makes a critical distinction in online worlds and how the primary appeal of virtual worlds is that they involve alternate social worlds and not, as often assumed, alternate social selves. And this is brought up in the show. In the first episode, Moriko, as Hayashi, assures Kanbei by saying, "There's no need to worry, a game is a game, and the real world is the real world." And the world created serves this distinction. The backgrounds are perpetually vivid and colorful, yet incredibly static. When Lily and Hayashi are walking together, she utters that the scenery is beautiful, and yet the birds are running at fives, drawing attention to the animesis of the cut. Still, at the same time, it transitions to still characters with moving backdrops, drawing attention to the world's virtuality. This is in stark contrast to the 6th episode where Sakurai and Moriko have their first major walk together outside of the game. Here, the cuts emphasize a completely different animatic language. Movement is forward, controlling, with layers sliding off each other. Space moves in. The walk shares the perspective of both Moriko and Sakurai, an empathetic camera that cuts on objects, everything always in motion. If this is the mirror, then once again, it doesn't reflect. It's a pairing that stresses these spaces as separate. Again, to reference Manning, the primary appeal of virtual worlds is that they involve alternate social worlds and not, as often assumed, alternate social selves. And that gets at the heart of it, I think. For Net-juu, they aren't projecting themselves, but rather creating new lives. And so instead of performance, I think we should consider animation from an anthropological perspective as a way of understanding how the show animates virtuality.
En cherchez encore, qu'est-ce que c'est? Vous n'auriez pas une petite idée?
This is Bridget Walker's The Silent Spectre of Motion, a 2012 finalist film in which a ghost stands out, emphasizing the motions of everyday life as a sort of puncturing of what we think of as natural, and thus it shifts from drawings to real life to a fake documentary-esque rendition of that life. Each rendition draws attention to the falsity of animation, that for us to buy it as animation, we have to buy into the life and motion of animation. And when the ghost shows up, the natural world is interrupted, revealing how much of it is animated. And Walker's work is useful because the artist is underlying a specific way of thinking about motion, particularly relevant to Net-juu. See, Walker is working on Alan Cholodenko's work on animation, in which if we believe the broad definition of animation as bringing to life, then there's quite a profound implication. What have we brought to life? And how does that relate to us? Teri Silvio has also talked about animation by defining it as the projection of qualities perceived as human, life, power, agency, will, personality, and so on, outside of the self and into the sensory environment through acts of creation, perception, and interaction. Here, someone being someone else is itself a form of animation. They are giving life to these separate identities. Where there is Moriko and Sakurai, there is also Hayashi and Lily. They are, to call upon Silvio, acts of creation, perception, and animation. And this is an ongoing sentiment, especially in digital ethnographies, that avatars are themselves animated, given life. There is an emphasis of object relations injecting, so to speak. So when Sakurai is frustrated about how he should approach Moriko, the pan of Lily is from the high angle, rendering her more like a doll, an object. And it's into that object that Sakurai breathes life. But that act of creation is, interestingly, through an animated show. We're watching one kind of animation talk about another. And its focus on coincidence brings to life that animus, that projection, doesn't it? That romance is based entirely on coincidence. It's a ripping of the naturalism we'd expect from what would be an otherwise calming show, like Walker's Ghost, drawing attention to the everyday to stress the motions that we might otherwise call animation. The love story is predicated on coincidences that you ultimately either have to buy into or you don't. That you either project life, power, agency, will, and personality into the sensory environment, or you don't, and thus the animus fails. In this case, the narrative becomes a reflexive analogy of its own animation. Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida has a beautiful passage where he talks about trying to find the perfect photo that encapsulates his mother's goodness. In it, he comes across this picture of his mother in the winter garden of her as a young girl, something he cannot have a memory of. Underlying this sort of reaction is the adventure that the photograph takes you on. To Barthes, it animates him, and he animates it. And that's what I think is important when we talk about animation, the multiplicity of the lens. And yet, even as I talk about the alternative lens of animation, let's talk about an alternative lens to mine.
As the English name suggests, a very big part of the appeal of Recovery of an MMO Junkie is getting to watch a very emotionally broken girl, well, recover. The means by which we get to see her recover is through watching her enjoy, as the Japanese name suggests, a wonderful net life. The main narrative weight of her recovery boils down to Moriko's status as a NEET. Whether or not Moriko quit her job because of her working environment, or her workload, or whatever, doesn't really matter. What does matter is the fact that after quitting her job, she decided to become a NEET. Sure, she touts with pride that she is an but her decision to become one still has some implications. However, by recontextualizing the fact that her entire character arc revolves around building a new relationship with another person, her status as a NEET serves to remind us as the audience that every time she becomes a bit closer to that person, she is overcoming a very large internal struggle in order to do so. In fact, upon some contemplation, this narrative might even seem too drastic, with how fast she opens up to a complete stranger beginning to tug on the audience's suspension of disbelief. However, all of this is somewhat justified by MMO Junkie's usage of the titular MMO. When Moriko entered her MMO, she was immediately presented with options that would soften the impact of all of the social aspects of MMOs. She was given the opportunity to control what others saw of her, and she took this chance by creating a male character instead of a female one, hiding a bit of her identity. This also had the added bonus of having an even lower profile, for girls often draw more attention in games because of how rare they can be. She was also able to name her character Hayashi, an extremely generic Japanese name akin to Bob in the US, hiding even more of her identity. In doing this, she was able to reveal as little information about herself as possible, and thus created a generic persona to hide behind. Behind this persona, Moriko would not need to fear any of her past emotional baggage catching up with her, except when it does, and thus would be able to feel more comfortable playing the game. Furthermore, when social interaction did actually occur in the game, namely when Ayashi came into contact with Lily, these interactions were also significantly simpler than ones in real life. After all, online chatting is really just an exchange of text with small added flourishes like emoticons and acronyms. On the other hand, real-life conversation has other aspects to account for, like physical appearances, body language, bodily processes, and even the intonation of the voice. Yes, these avatars are given in-game voiceovers, but I think that this is really just a creative liberty to make these interactions feel a bit more lively. I came to this conclusion when I realized that even though the people in the bar in episode 1 were portrayed as drunk, and I had just assumed that they were concurrently drinking in real life, when Moriko drank beer IRL and was portrayed as buzzed before jumping into the game, Ayashi's character model had not been portrayed as buzzed as well, and that the show was just willing to play the in-game parallels to real life a bit fast and loose. Thus, when Moriko was able to forego all of these other aspects of conversation and just focus on the exchange of ideas and words, she was able to gain a read on the personality of this Lily character much more easily and grow more intimate with her. There's several moments in the show when these advantages of communicating online are addressed, such as when an uncomfortably long pause is hand-waved due to a made-up coffee spill, or when an apology comes in the form of an onslaught of crying emojis instead of an actual heartfelt response. It is by having all of these perks of anonymity that Moriko is able to so believably grow in the way that she does. Had she tried to make a connection with Sakurai in real life from the start, she would arguably been unable to connect with him, and this entire relationship never would have existed. Need proof? Most of the latter half of the show focuses on Sakurai and Moriko's real-life interactions, and it is awkward. They both, but Moriko especially, feel the brunt of those aspects of conversation omitted by online messaging. It was really only the fact that they had already been previously attached via a more simplified form of communication that they were able to eventually move past this and, dare I say, hold hands.
Oh my, how lewd.
Throughout the entire show, the MMO is used kind of as a crutch in order to ease Moriko back into conducting human interactions and developing meaningful relationships. And sure, in the context of the show, this is just a writing device to tell an otherwise fairly conventional romantic plotline, but the way in the show decides to rationalize the use of this device in itself is pretty interesting. So that's how Recovery of an MMO Junkie justifies the social growth of its social recluse of a protagonist by using MMOs as a way to ease her back into social interaction. It plays to the idea that anonymity fosters intimacy and builds its character interactions and progression around this very notion.
So first off, I've been drinking. I want to thank Sleep Insomniac for providing his half of the video. I think it's absolutely interesting, his perspective on this, and I think it's good. You know, if we're going to be talking about like alternative views, then it's important to talk about alternative views to those alternative views and sort of how they sort of play about in a lot of different ways. Definitely please check out his channel. It is absolutely Definitely please check out his channel. It is absolutely interesting. He made a few really cool videos, of which I will somehow, somewhere post them. I have no idea. But you know, it's kind of interesting, right? The idea that you have these sets of coincidences that bring attention to the way in which we think of narrative, right? You know, we think of narrative as a sort of seamless construct or entity in which it has this ability to impose a sort of linearity upon us, right? You know, we watch it and it happens, but what happens when it sort of has a rupture as a result of that? You know, the idea of like the coincidence is itself that moment where that rupture occurs, right? You know, where it breaks apart with all of that, and they draw attention to that in the show. You know, like where Sakurai says like, oh, this can't possibly be it. You know, this is just a coincidence, and so on and so forth. So it is really fascinating in that context, and there's a lot of other like little things strewn about Net-juu that I think really sort of make it fascinating from the perspective of animation as a sort of injection. Huge thanks to everybody who has helped out on Patreon. Thank you very much. This channel would not be possible, or at least the things done on this channel would not be possible without the backings of everybody here. I would be a much more sober human being if we didn't. But that said, the names scroll to the right. The names scroll to the right here. Huge thanks to everybody. And yeah, if you enjoy the channel, please subscribe. Please support us. And that is pretty much it. I will see everybody later.